Hey, good evening, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Mondays with Maishi. This is, of course, your host, Maishi Norman, out in Lakewood, New Jersey, where it was a sunny 60 degrees today on January 2nd. Go figure. So it's good to be back for another week of Mondays with Maishi. Nice to see y'all back in here. For those of you who can turn on your videos, of course, we love seeing people and interacting. It makes it more personal. And for those of you who can't, of course, we understand it's late at night for many of you, very, very early in the morning for some of you, including our featured guest tonight, Rabbi Avi Tenenbaum, out in Jerusalem, Israel, where it is now 4 o'clock in the morning.
That's right.
I've been texting back and forth for the past hour. So since 3 o'clock in the morning for Avi, actually the fast of Asar B'Teves is beginning just about now. He just had his last sip of coffee, presumably, now that it's 4 o'clock, and it's really, really nice to have you tonight on the show. I know we met in person. We had some good chemistry going a couple of months back, and a lot of fascination with some of the work that you do. Tonight's topic is the topic of psychological first aid. Avi, tell us who you are, first of all. What does psychological first aid mean? Is that something that you yourself created? Are you the innovator of this, or is this something that's been around? Just first tell us who you are and then what psychological first aid is.
Gotcha. So first of all, thank you for inviting me. It's great to be here, and I'm very impressed with this whole thing. And you must be helping so many people learn new techniques, get better, and that translates into helping people in the real world, and that's exciting. That's amazing to consider. So I am 38 years old. I've been living in Israel more than half my life. I kind of consider myself Israeli. We speak Hebrew at home. I went to university here. I became an EMT here. I volunteer in the police here. And I'm originally from Chicago, and that's where the English is from. I work a lot in Hebrew, but also in English. Often I'll forget words, so I'll say them in Hebrew and then translate them into English. So be patient with me if that happens. Psychological first aid is something that we've known we needed it for a long time, and it existed in a certain capacity. And I'm not the inventor of it, but I think there's a unique aspect that I've been focusing on. So the idea that people show up to very traumatizing situations like wartime, and then they get what used to be called shell shock, for example, which was like the precursor to PTSD. So soldiers would show up in World War I, World War II, Vietnam. Vietnam was a big turning point, by the way, in the invention of PTSD. So people would show up to these events and they would come back different and broken. And we understood that we needed to somehow help them. And so there was this idea of giving psychological first aid in that setting, in the military setting. So that's been around. I think in our heritage of Judaism, we have the idea of lending a hand when somebody's down. And I think all cultures must have that. And the idea that people are going through challenging times and we lend them a hand, that's not a new idea either. What happened in America was, in my opinion, is that when September 11th occurred, which was a very surreal moment when I was a young person, I was not living in New York, I was in Colorado at the time, but that was our Kennedy was shot moment for my age. So when that happened, there was a massive need for psychological services for trauma, and at least for acute trauma. In other words, these buildings just fell down. So many people died, were injured, witnessed this, and were connected. You know, in trauma, you have circles. So you have like somebody that died, and you have the spouse, and you have the children, and the coworkers in the neighborhood. And before you know it, you have these ripple effects. And they found that there was not enough resources to deliver psychological services for all those people in the United States. And so there was this summit in upstate New York, I think it was in 2003 or 4, where these experts from around the world in disaster behavioral health, they tried to say, what are the main components that we need to address when helping somebody after really bad things happen? And they put this together into some sort of a model. And then they went teaching it to laymen, because that's the idea, is that you can teach this to anybody. And as long as they're skilled in providing it, they can support people going through the worst moments of their life until or if they need professional help. And that's just like we have the parallel of physical first aid. You have people that are lifeguards and people that in Israel, you have a 44-hour course. You have EMTs, which I'm an EMT here in Israel, so that's 200 hours. And I'm not a doctor, I'm not a surgeon, not even a paramedic, but we know enough to hand that person over to the next level of care and to be there for them until that's available. That was the idea of psychological first aid. So it's not my idea. But what happened is in the United States, this concept became applied to mega mass casualty events. So only events that were like of unbelievably large proportions, like September 11th, a hurricane, an earthquake, a mass shooting in a school, that's when people thought that they should do psychological first aid. And I think there's a massive amount of room to do this with smaller, more ambiguous tragedies that are more domestic. They may not make the news, or they'll be like a little blip on Yeshiva World's news. But for that family, that is a hurricane. For that family, that is a tragedy. And you have people that show up to those scenarios, whether it's a therapist, an educator in a school, a Hatzalah member, an EMT, a police officer, a firefighter. These are the people that are at a house after a child died in a fire. And there's nobody to save, there's just an investigation, and people are hanging around on scene for 3 hours because you have to investigate and take pictures. And so the firefighters are walking around, and here's this family standing at 3 a.m. Their child died in a fire. So they're not going anywhere. Nobody's running to the hospital. How do we support them? What do we do for them until they get in touch with their aunt and uncle, their psychiatrist, their therapist, etc.? And that's what I've been trying to talk about the last few years.
Avi, can you tell me what's your formal degree, first of all? Where were you trained? And then I want to understand how you fell into this interest.
So I actually was interested in this before any academic learning. I did study social work, and I studied leadership, and I studied disaster management, and I also studied law enforcement and emergency medicine as an EMT. And all of those things come together from top to bottom to provide a certain perspective. In other words, one of the things that really bothered me was there were some people involved in this field in the world who, they're big names, but I don't know how much experience they have in the field with people during a crisis. And the idea of, doing a CPR on a child who was murdered, which is something that I did with my own hands a few months ago, and knowing what that's like for a first responder and giving him psychological first aid. Or when you're done doing the CPR, giving psychological first aid to the family, which I did. And so there's a lack of this experiential knowledge in certain spaces.
Wow.
And that's on a micro level. And then on a macro level, I feel that there's a lot to offer as well, because let's say I live in Israel and we have rocket attacks every few months, especially during the summer. For some reason, we always have these rocket barrages of hundreds of rockets. And I've been down south and up north during many wars in Israel. And for every rocket that's shot down by our Iron Dome defense system, there are still 5% of people who experience that and endure acute traumatic stress. They have acute reaction to traumatic stress. So the rocket didn't hurt anybody physically. It didn't blow up a school. It didn't knock down a house, but people witnessed it. I've been shot at with rockets. It's not pleasant. Let's put it that way. And suddenly now you have to create on a public health level an answer to psychological first aid, because imagine you are running a hospital and now the ambulance service is busy carting away droves of people who are traumatized, and they dump them in an emergency room, and then they just sit around for hours, and then eventually they get triaged, and then they're probably okay at some point and they go home. So it's a big waste of time. It taxes the system, and it wasn't helpful. So I have a lot of interesting things to talk about from the macro to the micro, and all in between.
So, okay, so let me just clarify. What you're saying is that if that there are so many people who can be the executors and the administrators of psychological first aid. This is not exclusive to mental health professionals.
Yes.
It's exclusive to anybody who might make it down as a first responder, whether that's a family member, an educator, support, EMT, police officer. I mean, pretty much everyone in the gamut who might be present at a disaster or a tragedy is somebody who can administer psychological first aid. And so you're saying, let's disseminate this information to the masses so people can be psychological first aiders to those who they may encounter going through a situation. Okay.
Absolutely. And this is recommended by many prominent organizations. Let's say in the United States, you have the Veterans Affairs Department, we have the National Traumatic Stress Network for Children, the NCTSN, you have the Red Cross, you have the World Health Organization. There is a consensus of experts that this is a good idea. Why we should do it, which you asked before, I didn't answer yet, and what does it do? Maybe we'll get there soon, but it's definitely recommended by some people, at least, if not most.
Avi, I want to ask you two things. Okay, first of all, can you give us some idea of the potential difference that psychological first aid can make in the trauma response? In other words, if we respond on site in the moment within minutes of a traumatic event versus if we don't respond and then the person goes to therapy starting a week later or a month later or a year later when they start to have symptoms. What's the difference between administering first aid on the spot versus waiting?
This is a really interesting question and topic. You know, I like to say the reason why I do psychological first aid, or PFA as I call it, isn't in order to prevent PTSD, although that may happen. I feel it's right to do because it's humane. Somebody fell down and I want to pick them up, and I would want somebody to be there for me in my time of distress. Although, presumably, it would be helpful to help somebody in their worst moment of life and show them that the world is thinking of them and helping them find self-efficacy in those moments. You know what I'm thinking of is like, this is just one aspect of it, but let's say you have a person who's sexually abused, which I don't deal with, and I'm not relating that to PFA. But for the sake of example, this person was sexually abused. They were raped by an uncle, let's say, and then they go and share this with parents, and the parents don't believe them for whatever reason. Well, obvious reasons, right? And so it's adding insult to injury. It's now that I'm hurting and I'm in this raw place and I'm barely managing, I'm looking to see, does the world hold me? You know, is the world able to offer me support? Can the world elicit from this person their inner resources? And then they're going to experience the worst moments of their life a little bit less terrible. And I think that's very profound. And at least anecdotally, this is the experience of a lot of people. In fact, last night I got a very touching message from a certain person who was dissociating at a funeral. And I happened to be at this funeral, and I jumped in, and you know, all the askanim were getting on top of this person and saying, don't let them see the kabura, take them away to the hospital. And I said, just leave the person alone, give them their space, let me speak to them. And stepping in there and bringing them back to the here and now, and encouraging them that, you know, they're having a normal reaction to an abnormal situation, and it's very overwhelming. I'm here with you now. I'm going to help you. I'm not going to leave you alone. So they sent me a WhatsApp. They said, you totally changed my entire experience. You made it from the absolute worst thing to unbelievable help that I couldn't imagine. And I think at least that's what we're trying to do. I remember a researcher at a conference who was doing research in emergency rooms in Israel on blood pressure after traumatic events. So let's say anybody that goes in a car accident will take their blood pressure and they would try to measure paratraumatic signs and symptoms that can predict PTSD. Like, is that possible? Can I see people in a car accident and predict that they'll have PTSD? It seems in the literature like that's not so simple. It's just not. So this person said to me, if you can't predict PTSD, then why are you doing PFA? So I said, you're telling me that if you lost a child, you would put a sign on your door saying, nobody bother me, because you can't guarantee that you're going to predict that you're going to prevent PTSD. Don't knock on my door. Don't come to the Shiva. Don't support me because it may not prevent PTSD. And obviously she wouldn't say that. So, does it prevent? It doesn't prevent. I don't know. And it seems in literature that's not simple, but it's the right thing to do at least.
Okay. Avi, let's do something tragic and fun at the same time. Okay, tell us a little bit about some of the most tragic and most disastrous situations. I just want to say, for the record, for those of you who are on and might watch this, I personally sent Avi Tenenbaum down to a situation that I had family members who were living in an apartment building at the time that there was an arson, and somebody came and basically burnt down their apartment buildings in Jerusalem. I had a number of family members living there, actually 2 siblings who were living there with their families, so probably in about 10, 12, or 15 people. Some of them jumped out of the windows, had to carry their families, shimmy them down pipes, and it was quite a traumatic incident. This happened about a year or so ago, and I needed someone to turn to, and I said, gosh, these people are thousands of miles away from me. How am I going to help my family? And I said, of course, I'm going to reach out to Avi Tenenbaum, and Avi was there within, I don't know, I was there, so was it minutes or hours, but he took the time to go down and speak with the families. I think all the 30 families that were there, and the feedback was that it was tremendously helpful. But I can't imagine that was even from the worst situations that you were present at. Tell us some of the most horrific ones and how you were able to administer your work there.
That call was unique in a certain way, and just in the way that every trauma incident has its own characteristics. And so when you've been to over 2,000 tragedies, which I've been to at this point, you start to see how you can kind of predict how people will show up in the days after an incident based on what happened. And so in that fire, a random pyromaniac who nobody recognized, didn't live in the building, nobody heard of him. He decided to set a building on fire at 3 a.m. And that woke people up, hundreds of people up at 3 a.m. with smoke billowing into their windows, or with firefighter hoses shooting water into their windows and putting fire out. And so this created trauma cues of not being able to sleep at night, hypervigilance, because how can I let my guard down? I did it last night and almost burned to death, so I can't go to sleep tonight. And every time somebody would take the shower or they would run the sink, they would hear the firefighter hose, and that would be very traumatic. So it was interesting. One of the hardest calls I've ever been to was a matricide suicide, which was a mother with, it seems like she had postpartum stress, postpartum depression. She murdered all of her children one by one in a room, and then set the place on fire and killed herself. And the investigation there only allowed for one person to be present with the remaining family member of that story. And so that's tragic as it is. It's unproportionately unthinkable, such an event. But it was even harder for me as a responder to be there by myself. Because if I do PFA work with a partner, even if I know the partner is in another room speaking to somebody else, I feel a perceived sense of support. I'm not by myself. And that's the self-care, vicarious trauma, first responder burnout, etc. That angle. Well, this is direct trauma. But what my friends in that scenario actually did was they messaged me on WhatsApp, "We're waiting in a car for you outside with hot food." You know, that was very helpful for me to know. And that's this idea. I became the person that needed help to get strength from them so I can give strength to this person.
Yeah, I kind of glossed over the part earlier where you commented that the first responders themselves, the EMTs and the police who witnessed some of these horrific events and tragedies, they themselves can benefit from PFA, psychological first aid. That's a great point, right? We're so busy thinking about the quote unquote victims and not thinking about the heroes who suffer from so much PTSD and burnout.
Yeah, there's a lot to talk about in that area. It's not only them, but it's at least them. I'm going to digress for a second and say that PFA work has many levels to it. So you have minutes after the fire showing up on scene and helping people. Okay. But then you have the next 3 hours later. You're the person that's taking over for that guy that showed up first. Or you're the person that is going to be there the next day. Or you're the teacher in the school the next day of a child that died by suicide the day before. Or you're the rabbi or priest or community leader of some sort of community that suffered a catastrophic loss, and now you have to lead the community through the loss for the next month. And so there's all these different levels of PFA, and I make it sound as if it's only about showing up and seeing, helping people and leaving. That's certainly the main gig, if you will, that I'll teach most people. But for mental health professionals and community leaders already in a position of management and leadership, there's the grief leadership aspect, the whole next day until a month aspect. And that's significant because you don't just abandon somebody after you're done an hour later. You're handing them over to something else, to somebody else. And we're continuing this process of holding the people and supporting them until they're settled. And that takes time. They just suffered a catastrophic loss. You know, this is not a 2-hour thing, you know. So in first aid, physical first aid, I'll show up to somebody who fainted and I'll take their vitals and I'll see what's going on, but then I'm going to turn them over to the hospital. But then the hospital is going to follow up and release them, and then the family doctor is going to continue with that person. So TFA is like that as well.
Okay, for those of you who just joined, if you can turn on your videos, please do. We always like to see as many people as we can. It makes it more personal and more real and genuine. For those of you who have questions or would like to ask, of course, click the reactions tab on the bottom right of your screen and raise your hand, and you can certainly ask a question. Before we go more into PFA, I'm still curious. Yeah, my understanding is you've been to countries and war zones around the world. Some of the countries are countries that's names I can't pronounce. Many of them are names that I've never heard of. Tell us a little bit about some of your excursions and to which countries you've been, what roles you've taken on in those war zones.
Well, war zones, starting at home, I've been up north and down south, even before leaving the borders of Israel in the Second Lebanon War, going up to Tzfat and doing psychological first aid, going down south in all the other subsequent wars and skirmishes in Israel. That's something else, you know, being in an intifada, being in terror attacks, knowing people that were murdered in terror attacks, which I lost a number of people that were meaningful to me in terror attacks. As far as abroad, I've trained people overseas in 4 continents. I'd like to get out more. COVID really slowed me down, but we hope to relaunch courses after April this year. In fact, I even plan on doing a speaking tour in America, in New York, New Jersey in February, March. If anyone's interested in inviting me, you can get in touch at my website, psychotraumaunit.com. You know, I did a lot of work with Russia, Ukraine. I made a lot of strong relationships with people there. I did training for psychologists who support soldiers on the front lines, psychologists who are supporting people whose children are missing in action. That was something that I did in person and on Zoom multiple times over the beginning of the war. So in Lviv, I did this for the government of Ukraine. It was contracted out to an NGO, but working with some very special people there. I actually, Moshe, you asked me, you were interested in this before. This is a USSR era captain's hat that I picked up on my last trip over there. But, you know, stepping into that space of people whose children might be killed in action, missing in action, you know, having ambiguous loss. Should they move on? They shouldn't move on. You know, how could we support mothers who are asking what decision to make as far as how to go about their day? It's a big honor and privilege, and it's a bit frightening the amount of responsibility that you take in this role sometimes. When there's a kfura, how do you say kfura? A funeral, burial. And, you know, people say to a mother, don't see your child be buried. It will be too hard for you. And you have to advocate for somebody and say, you get to choose what you want to do. What would you like to do? Would you like to see your child's body, or you wouldn't? What would you prefer? You know, I realize I keep digressing from your question, but
well, I mean, I was curious to some of the places that you've been and what your role has been. Let's jump in. How about if we jump into psychological first aid, PFA itself, what the model is, and then you could talk about how you may have, you know, I guess contextually, I'll talk about how you may have applied this in different situations. I know you spoke about one tragedy you've been to, one country you've been to, but I understand you've been to thousands of tragedies, and some of them really gruesome and sad and horrific.
yeah, most of the events that I've done are domestic, but I have been to Hurricane Harvey in the United States. I was in the Pittsburgh Tree of Life massacre. I was involved in that. Yeah, I've been around. I've done some stuff online from afar, like I think it was called the Owo Nigerian Church Massacre. I did some work with them recently. I just want to add an interesting point that you can imagine. I've been traumatized just a lot of times in this type of work. And I have people that hold me and help me when I need my assistance from them as well. But I'll just tell you that what's really interesting is, you know, trauma is highly subjective. And I find with myself that calls or incidents that don't necessarily traumatize everybody traumatize me. It's very personal. And so, for example, there was a person hit by a car this year, and coming and doing my EMT work on him just as a Hatzalah member, but seeing him conscious. He was severely wounded, but he was conscious, and seeing the terror in his eyes and seeing him scream and yell, and that was traumatizing to me. It's easier for me if somebody is dead or unconscious than if they're awake and they're aware of their own terror, and then I imagine their terror. I keep finding with myself that this is a recurring theme, just for me personally, and it's interesting that trauma is subjective that way.
Yeah, well, I can imagine, you know, if somebody has strong empathy and they're watching somebody go under, you know, as the life is being bled out of them, I can imagine that being quite traumatic.
Yeah.
More than seeing somebody, you know, who's already gone.
Yeah.
Okay,
So
obviously, let's talk a little bit about the model. What is PFA? What really, I guess I would start with a question of what takeaway, maybe it's like sort of the last question people would ask, and let's put it first. What takeaway would you want people who will administer PFA, you know, what's the message? What can we bring to the victims and the family members who are victims of these situations when we go? And then, like, you know, I just wonder, should all EMT services in the United States have a team of psychological first aiders, whether they're mental health professionals or lay people who are just trained in this? Should this become standard protocol? I guess that's a separate question, but tell us a little bit about how we could administer.
So I think the first thing you asked was like, what's that one takeaway if you had to remember one thing? And I feel very strongly that anybody can be supportive of anybody else. And a lot of us are very uncomfortable stepping into those spaces. And we say, who am I? I don't have this official capacity. I don't have brilliant academic degrees and training. But I think that anybody can lend a hand to somebody else. And especially with minimal training, they can do it in a professionalized, organized way. But just being there for somebody, just being present with someone, just saying, hey, if you need anything, I'm here for you. I'm going to be right here. What can I do for you now? These tiny, simple things that anybody can do in a moment for anybody else. And one of the stories that I see recurring over and over, because like I said, the main experiences I have are domestic. I've heard this on many occasions that somebody's loved one is dying or dead, and they're doing a CPR. CPR usually runs 45 minutes to an hour in Israel, let's say. And there's a wife, there's a father, there's somebody standing on the side all by themselves. And there's more than enough personnel. In other words, 9 people came, and let's say you don't need all 9 people to do CPR. There's at least one spare person. And that spare person, it could be a neighbor, it could be the Hatzalah member who's spare, can just approach that person and say, my name is Moshe. If you need anything, I'm here for you. And you'll see that when you say that to people, a lot of times people will ask you questions, they'll ask for assistance for things. And even if they don't ask anything, we find in research that the perceived social support that was offered to them is key. It's not that you actually helped them, it's that they felt you were willing to help them. And that's major. And anybody could do it.
And what does that do for them?
They feel held. They feel that they're not alone. They feel that aside from the actual help that's offered to them, where we orient them and we try to discover their inner resources and put them back on track, aside from all of that, aside from bringing them back from dissociation, from hypoarousal and hyperarousal, which we didn't even talk about yet, but just the fact that in the absolutely worst hellish moments of life, Moshe was with me. I wasn't going through it alone. You know what you see a lot of times? This might sound silly, and I've seen this last week at a trauma incident of a young person that died. You see neighbors and family giving tons of cups of water to somebody who just suffered a loss. And when you've gone through over 2,000 tragedies as a witness of 2,000 different tragedies, you start to realize that this is a person's way of feeling useful. They want to do something for the person that went through a tragedy. They don't know what to do, and they feel that they are not allowed to just be present. They have to do something, and so they're going to give water. I remember an illustrative case that I use in my course of a young mother who was, 40 maybe. She had many children in Yerushalayim, in Jerusalem, and she had a seizure that didn't end. Sometimes a seizure pans out after a few minutes. She had what we call here status epilepticus, and she died, it seems, from a seizure. And the children aren't picked up from school, and they call the father to pick up the kids. He picks up all the kids, comes home, and they find the mother dead on the floor. And that's a common thing, and that's a type of tragedy that Hatzalas deal with all the time that you don't hear in the news. It doesn't make the headlines. But, so in that case, they brought a young yeshiva student home, to see his mother's body and to be there for the funeral, etc. And there was like these 3 or 4 community leaders hovering over this 16-year-old boy, handing him water. And I counted like 5 cups of water that they handed him within 20 minutes. And I said, like, you can't drink 5 cups of water. Like, just stop. Just be with him. Just be there. Mm-hmm. That is major.
Okay, so you talked about the people who will be struggling with either hyperarousal because they're what we would call freaked out from what's going on, or hypoarousal because they're withdrawing and dissociating or splitting from what's going on. I imagine that if we're mindful of that and we notice that happening, that we can be helpful in some way. Tell us, how can we be helpful?
This is somebody's writing something.
Yeah, I'll shoot out the questions. You don't have to worry about them.
Okay. Would it be okay if I did a screen share quickly?
Oh, sure. Go ahead.
Okay, let's try that.
And for those of you who have questions, please raise your hand. Let's make it interactive.
So I'm just using this and another slide here to just answer your question. This is taken from my 16-hour course that I hope to be giving more in person. and on Zoom very soon, hopefully in April. If you're interested, contact me. So there are many models, there are many approaches of psychological first aid. I think most of them share similar components, and I don't see a need to reinvent the wheel. I know some people that were doing a doctorate, so they kind of like created a cute acronym and called it some new thing, but it's just same old stuff. I think the approach that I take that I appreciate most is I use the 8-step model of the NCTSN. I'm happy to send this to Moshe to send out or whatever. You can contact me, I'll send it out. You can download this on the internet on your own as well. But these are 8 very simple steps, kind of like a checklist. And it doesn't have to be in this order, but it's generally in this order, where you're walking into chaos. And this may be an hour after an event, it may be a day after an event. And it's very rudimentary. So I'll run through it real fast, but I teach this for 16 hours. So you walk onto the scene, you introduce yourself, because if you forget to do that, people don't know who you are and what you want from them. And you ensure safety and comfort. And that's step 2. And what that's referring to is Maslow. In other words, if I show up to a trauma incident and a person has no pants on, and I try to do psychological first aid, but they don't have any pants on, they're going to be preoccupied that they don't have pants on. And you may laugh at that example, but that was a case that I went to in Jerusalem a number of years ago. There was a hotel fire in the middle of the night, and the very first priority was helping 5 people get pants on at 3 a.m. in the middle of Rehov Hanavim in Jerusalem. And so there was a hospital nearby, and we had to be resourceful and borrow pants and bring the pants of the hospital to these people and put them in somewhere because it's freezing. And the paparazzi is taking pictures of them. So there's no safety and comfort. You have to first provide the most basic physiological, simple needs before you can hold a conversation. And that's step 2. And it might be water, it might be food, it might be shelter, it might be shielding people from the media. And I've seen that a lot of times, is that a high-profile case happens and every news station comes, and all you need to do is take an umbrella, open it up, hold it sideways, and walk with the person from one place to the other, and no one sees them, and that's helpful to them. And that's even before you held conversation. And then step 3 is stabilization. And that's referring to a case where I can't hold a conversation with the person because they're too hypo or hyper aroused. And when that happens, we have different presentations of what that might look like, what acute traumatic stress looks like. And we have different interventions that we match for those situations. And this is taken from interventions and models all around the world. And I kind of neatly organized it into step 3. Right? So I showed up, I introduced myself, I got them some pants. I see that I can't have a conversation with them. They keep coming in and out and dissociating. And I need to bring them back to the present, let's say. Or they feel utterly helpless and I give them a task. Or they feel unsafe because they were just barraged with 30 rockets. And I'm able to, if it's possible, emphasize that the threat is over and we're here now in the bomb shelter, if that's true. And that's a sticky area to go into, so I won't go into that now. Hypoarousal. People that are lethargic, they're barely moving, they're conscious. Sometimes they're not even conscious. How do you bring them out of that? But if they're conscious and they're lethargic and they're lying around, how do I get them to start moving quickly and come back to themselves? And all of that fits into 3. And then 4 is you ask the person.
Wait. So Avi, how would you bring somebody from a state of lethargy, and bring them to be more present with themselves?
Well, if the person, for example, is barely moving and they're confused and they're overwhelmed to the point where they can barely talk and they're mumbling, that's a common type of presentation that you'll see. You're going to want to bring them into you, use your name, use your eyes, have them focus on you, bring them into the moment, ask them to do very simple tasks. They'll say, can you raise your hand? Can you squeeze my hand? Can you try to sit up? Can you take with me 3 steps? And you start to build on that little by little, little by little. And then you try to think of the cognition that they need to hear at that time. So you'll say, I'm here with you now. I'm going to help you. We're going to get through this together. And now they feel that they have more resources to go through what they perceive they don't have enough resources to deal with. So it's all this type of stuff that we're
Okay,
going to do.
Well, let's stay on this slide. I'm curious. And hyperarousal, you write, ask cognitive technical questions. So explain this.
Somebody is marching all over the room, practically jogging around, yelling, screaming, and you're able to try to talk to them very slowly. And you're using the speed of your voice and the tone of your voice. And if it's safe and if it's possible, you're going to hook your arm around them and you're going to say, let's walk a little bit. And then you're going to walk with them at their pace and start to slow it down and start to slow it down. And so you're kind of, you're helping them to find the right pace and you're bringing them into that place. And you're going to ask them technical questions. What's your birthday? What's your address? Where do you work? What type of car do you have? And that comes out of an Israeli technique called the 6 C's model of Dr. Farhi, where the idea would be that when your amygdala is fired up, then you want to use the prefrontal cortex and to be very cerebral to kind of extinguish or take away the space of extreme emotion. So if I ask you, what's your birthday? And I force you to think, you step into a different place. And in that place, you can be more rational and you can come back to a reasonable place. And the goal of all of this, by the way, is just to help a person be effective in that situation and return them to the baseline before the event so they can do whatever it is that they have to do. That's all it is.
Okay, let's go to dissociation.
So dissociation, you know, there's a lot of techniques out there that come from somatic experiencing and EMDR. I am not yet convinced that there's anything unique that those offer that we don't already do without calling it fancy names. I think the idea of touch, I think the idea of, you know, having somebody squeeze your hand or tapping on somebody's shoulders, having them look in your eyes, calling out their name, you know, and reminding them where they are and what's going on. This is really anchoring them and bringing them to right here and right now. And you're doing this over and over. Do you know where we are right now? Right now, we're in the, what do you call the hall that you make a levaya in? We're in the funeral home. We're at the funeral of your child. Your child passed away, and now I'm here with you in this moment with all these people at the service. And what happened was you fainted, and I'm here with you now after that. And my name is Avi, and your name is so-and-so. You know, can you hear me? Can you see me? Do you know where you are? And you're repeating this over and over and trying to engage them basically and pulling them in, reeling them in, kind of like fishing.
Yeah. So, and then you say, if they're helpless, you give them a task, which I guess makes them feel like they're present and have a purpose.
Yes, and that's really important because one of the aspects of acute trauma is people feel utterly helpless. The paramedics are busy doing something. They're trying to save the child from the CPR, you know, that drowned in the pool. And the mother wants to feel important. She wants to feel she can do something. She's in the worst moment of her life and she's powerless. And so we're trying to think of something that she can do to be helpful. You know, a cute example that I actually did with people in Ukraine with this, it's a little bit different, but a lot of people felt guilt that they couldn't go to war because they were older, they were disabled, they had several children, and their neighbors and brothers went off to war and were dying and getting wounded, and they're sitting at home, and maybe they have the best excuse why they have to be home, but they feel helpless. And that's a very stressful thing to feel when your country is being attacked. You don't know when you're going to have power, and you don't even feel like you're involved in the war effort. And so having children make pictures for soldiers to hand when people are driving by in tanks, you know, giving them support, saying, you know, way to go, we're cheering for you. Having citizens in Ukraine to make all sorts of gear or fundraise money for drones. That wasn't just a technical thing. That was a way for people to feel useful during a time when they felt utterly helpless, which is part of how people show up to highly traumatic events. It's very important, I think, for a person's recovery. That also comes from the 6 C's model. Sometimes a person needs something, by the way, and you don't know what they need unless you ask them.
Mhm.
I remember a case of a man that drowned in a pool, and the wife shows up on scene, and I ask her, what do you need right now to go through this situation? And she says, right now, I need 20 children to pray for my husband, because it was still during a CPR. I need 20 children to pray for my husband. So I said, I'm on it. And we went outside and we got a bunch of kids to find a bunch more kids. And before you know it, within 5 or 10 minutes, we had 20 kids praying, which was meaningful to the spouse. And that's what she perceived was needed at that time. So spiritually, that may have helped, that may have been important, but that's not even the point. The point is she felt that's what has to happen right now and needed help executing that.
Wow.
Yeah.
Let's go to, I want to skip safety for a minute and go to rhetorical questioning.
Rhetorical questioning is really interesting. It's like when you see a person who's repeating the same sentence like 100 times, and they're saying, why did God do this? Why did he kill my child? Why did he do this? And they're just going over this over and over and over. And if you didn't know better, they're asking a question. And so you try to answer their question. You're a big philosopher. So you start quoting to them, what you learned in university, you start quoting them Jewish theology, and that's absolutely not what they're doing and not what they need to hear. What they're actually doing is they're expressing their feelings. They're expressing their shock, their pain, their disbelief, the surrealness, the utter craziness of these events. That's all they're doing. And what maybe can help them to stop that, because it's like they get stuck in that, is you validate that. You say, yes, it is absolutely crazy. Yes, there are no words. Yes, it makes no sense. And you're trying to anticipate what they're saying and what they're disclaiming and help them get that out and feel witnessed and feel understood. And you'll see when you've done that, that they come down. They come down from there and they're able to move on to the next step.
Well, I'm just thinking like this, in my mind, from a therapist perspective, this is one of the most important pieces here, because, people will get fixated on this and potentially develop all kinds of neuroses, because they were stuck and fixated in this repetition or repetitive tape playing, and it wasn't addressed, validated, and sort of digested in the moment. And coming in as a mental health professional, like that's what I would see. That's probably one of the first things I would see is the emotional distress, and how this is creating some new beast of repetition and obsession. And
By the way,
yeah,
when you talk about new beasts, there's not only one type of beast, but I love how you said that. There are many potential beasts that we can create if we're not careful and if we don't support people the right way. Simple example, if Uncle Larry died in a catastrophic car accident and nobody tells little Johnny, who's 10 years old, and then they have the funeral, and then they decide they're going to tell him next week, but he finds out 4 days from now in a way that he shouldn't find out in the newspaper, and he feels, why didn't anybody tell me? How come I wasn't the first one to hear about this? And for some reason, for a lot of people, that is extremely important. Why wasn't I included? This was a meaningful person to me. This was a meaningful process. I wanted to be there at the funeral and take part in what happened so I can have closure, and you stole that from me.
Mhm.
So there's all sorts of really interesting wounds that we can cause people if we're not careful. Another one, by the way, using the head of a psychotherapist, is when we lie to people.
yes.
So let's say a child drowned in a pool and we're doing a CPR, and we come and say to the parents, he's for sure going to be okay. The Ezras Hashem, he's going to be fine. Everything is going to be fine. And we're lying straight through our teeth. And there's a 99% chance things are not going to be fine. And what happens is, when we find out that it's not fine, you've just damaged authority in their eyes in a very deep way, because you're an authority figure. You're a Hatzalah member, you're a therapist, whoever you are, they were relying on you for information, and you stepped into a vulnerable place and you told them something that isn't true. So part of the name of the game is to stick to a reasonable level of truth in a piecemeal fashion that people can digest, certainly not to lie. So there's a lot of wounds that we can create if we do this the wrong way and if we don't do it the right way.
Avi, okay, so that leads to the question of safety, because I remember when we you and I met a few months ago. And if I recall, you were telling me a situation about a man who was in the ambulance, and I think he had cut his jugular or something, and he was bleeding to death. And he asked you whether he's going to live or something like that. Do you recall that? Or am I making that up?
Well, I've had too many calls like that I'm not sure which one is the problem, but
Okay. But I remember you telling me, what do we tell the man? I mean, do we tell him that he's going to survive? Do we tell him that he's not going to survive? Do we tell him what the chances are? Because
well,
the tab here is safety. Emphasize that the threat is over. Carefully when it is. What if it's
Right.
not?
right. The typical easy case where that's illustrated is where there's a terrorist attack, like there was one in my neighborhood like a month ago,
That's right.
and right, the bomb went off, and the police have their methods of investigating, seeing who did this, and declaring that everything is safe and you can come out, you can go about your business. And so when the police come out and say the threat is over, there was only one terrorist, we caught him, he's dead, maybe then you could say the threat is over. Or if you brought somebody from the outside in Stay Road who's being bombed, and you bring them into a bomb shelter, then you can say, we're in a safe place now. So the threat isn't over, but we are in a safe or safer place now. You have to be really careful when you talk about safety, and it has to be true.
But what happens if it's not true? Do we share that and scare the person even more? I mean, if somebody's on the verge of dying, I can imagine that the worst thing that can happen if we tell them that it's not true is that they'll die and we'll never know. But what about in situations that are more ambiguous than that?
I don't think we can lie to someone. I don't think we have to go out of our way to say, by the way, you're losing so much blood, you'll probably die in 2 minutes. If they ask you directly, which people do ask you, and Hatzalah members can tell this to you, they'll go over to the paramedic running a CPR and say, what's going on? What's the situation? So you can't say he's dead. Maybe we'll bring him back to life. You wouldn't say that, but you might say, it doesn't look good. It's a serious situation. We're trying the best that we can. And I'm going to give you every meaningful update that I can if anything changes. And you're welcome to ask as well any questions that you have. And so people feel heard, and people feel that you've addressed their concern and you're not leaving them in the dark. I remember a case of a young man who hung himself in a tree, and I came to do psychotrauma, and it happened to have been close to my house, and so the CPR was in progress. I came just a minute after they cut him down from the tree and we're doing CPR, and there's something called like agonal breathing, or there's like sounds that a nifter makes, that a deceased makes when you squeeze a balloon and air comes out, it makes a sound. So when you're squishing somebody in CPR, it can make a sound. And the parents were looking for this missing child, and they showed up on the scene of the CPR, and they hear the child making noise, and they assume, thank God he's better now, he's okay. And I needed to explain to them, I'm not sure if what you heard indicates that he's okay. It's a very serious situation. If it really does become better, I'll let you know about it. But the sounds that you just heard, I'm not sure that it's such a good sign. And I want you to keep waiting and see what happens. And we're trying to find the truest thing that we can say that they can digest piece by piece.
Well,
And there's a whole field of this, crisis communication. It's like a subfield in this world.
okay, Avi, you can jump back to the other. I'm sorry I made you stay on this slide, but I knew you were on the other one.
No, this is fun. This is great. So we've introduced ourselves. We've given them their pants. We've stabilized them, unless they didn't need to be stabilized, which not everyone needs to be. And that's a mistake a lot of people make. They're going to come do stabilization techniques when nobody needed to be stabilized. Then we're going to ask people what they need right now. We're also going to open our eyes and see what they need. Because you can probably figure out if somebody's house burns down, they need a place to sleep tonight. That's obvious. So you can know things without asking, but you certainly have to ask. And when you ask, they will tell you surprising things that you didn't know about. So you're looking, you're asking, and then you're delivering the assistance in step 5. You're giving them what you can. So you're not necessarily having them stay in your house, but you're going to work with them to figure out with their neighbors and their extended family and their community services who can host them, for example. And all the while you're giving them psychological support. 6 is where you're widening their social network because they can't go through this alone and you're not organic to their life. You just walked in because you're a police officer, because you're on a crisis team of some chesed, social welfare organization, but you want to get the aunt and uncle in there. You want to get the neighbors in there, the rabbi in there. And by the way, they can do things that nobody else can do. I remember a case of, I remember many cases where people were murdered and some of the worst possible things happened. Or I remember a case of a child drowning in a bucket of soap, and the rabbi came down and was able to be much more helpful to the family than I ever will be. He had a relationship with them. He was an authority figure for them. He was meaningful to them. He was able to do what's called grief leadership and lead them through the scene and then bear down the community resources to help the family. So we're widening their social circle in a way that we can leave and hand them to that circle. And then 7 is where we're providing for them psychoeducation. And that is so important. And that might interest you because that's like the therapist-y part. And that's where people become frightened of their symptoms. If it wasn't bad enough that they saw a terrorist attack, it's even scarier that they are jumpy, they keep having intrusive thoughts, they're hypervigilant, they don't want to get out of bed, they don't want to leave the house. And so we want to give them psychoeducation. And in one sentence, these are normal reactions to an abnormal situation. In at least up to 72 hours, this is completely par for the course. Of course, you can get help from a therapist. I can even teach you some techniques because, if you're a therapist and you know more techniques, you can do with them all sorts of grounding techniques. I do with people a lot of stuff from acceptance and commitment therapy, mindfulness, ways to kind of manage the thoughts that are imposing themselves on them, feelings that are barging in their guest house. But just letting people know you're not crazy for going crazy. And it's okay to completely fall apart and go crazy. And remember that I told that to you.
Yeah, so the normalization of the experience reduces their panic that they have.
Yes.
That they're
Yes.
experiencing. And how about talking to other people? Like, can they, do you tell them to reach out to somebody, a supportive person, and talk out what they're feeling?
So if they want to, they should. That's another subtopic in this where the old way of thinking was we would force people to debrief. We would force people to tell their story. And I think the newer way of thinking by almost everybody except John Hopkins is that if they want to share, they should. If they don't want to, they don't have to. And when they want to, they could. And even the amount that they want to is sufficient. So we can invite them, maybe, but it's certainly not necessary. And the way Dr. Everly and John Hopkins in his rapid model of PFA views it is that it is absolutely critical. And if you don't do it, they can't get out of their trauma and it's going to be terrible. I just don't see that to be true. But that's 7. That's the idea of offering psychoeducation. And then 8 is just connecting them to any other services that can help them be held and supported. So it might be meals. It might be a neighbor to take their kids to school. Anything and everything. It's the local charity organization to just give $10,000 in their bank account just to figure things out till they get on their feet, etc. This is pretty much PFA. How you apply it, how you triage it, how you do it with children and elderly, how you do it in groups, how you do it in mass casualty incidents. That's why it's a 16-hour course. But anybody can learn it. And I think you can become proficient in it. And if you are in a place where you interact with people a lot, you probably were in situations where you needed it. You were a teacher and there was some sort of tragedy. Even the Chaim Walder fiasco in Israel, which was a big sex scandal that happened here last year. There was no bomb that went off, but that was a type of unique, maybe different trauma incident where everybody's shaken up, everybody's in disbelief. And it was no different to me than the rockets that we had recently in Israel. Everybody needs some holding and they need some guidance. And they lost trust and authority, and they're trying to figure out what's going on, and the rug is pulled out from under them. There was a social disaster, but that's also a disaster. Maybe it's not the same as a mother murdering all her kids, but it's also a place we can step into and help in a certain sense.
Avi, if I can ask you to stop the share, if you're done with the
Yeah.
screen. But that's a really tough question. I mean, so how do we support? This is on such a macro level, where so many people are affected, from victims to those who felt they were cheated by him because he had written so many books and children's books and given speeches. I mean, how do you jump in on such a national disaster level where you can't really reach the people who were affected, because we don't know who they are and where they are, and they're also all over the place?
So, again, that's a great question, and I'm not saying that a rudimentary course in psychological first aid, 16 hours, is gonna help you be able to do that role, but somebody's gonna have to take that mantle, and people do. I think that there's a lot of power in making social media. You don't know how much people are craving for guidance after difficult things. They have so many questions, and even if all you do is you go to big people and you interview them, what people are asking, what people are talking about, and then you put that together and you make it publicly available, it's really helpful to people. So we had this double bombing in the center of the entrance to Jerusalem, and also right near my house at the big bus stop by my house a month ago. And we haven't seen bus bombings or bus stop bombings in a number of years, and those were terrible years. Those were unbelievable years. And I remember the number 2 bus bombing, and that was such an unspeakable time. And so this was really unsettling to people, that you stand at a bus stop and you blow up. You're not supposed to blow up when you stand at a bus stop. Children are not supposed to die when they go to school, and people needed guidance. And so making a simple YouTube video, which addresses some basic ideas, anticipating what people need to hear, putting it together in a 5 or 8 minute video and putting it up. I put it on a group called Secret Jerusalem in Israel, which has 110,000 people. And I got great reviews. People said this is so helpful. It helped me to realize a better perspective of how to go about what just happened, how to interpret it, how to realize that that's still an exception to the rule, how I'm still somewhat safer than I realize. Life still has to go on.
So, one of the things that I'm learning tonight is that we can't take for granted so many of the basics that we may assume people know or understand, and they may still need to hear it anyway. So,
Yes.
It's like you're telling us, when you're at these fiascos, lean in. Don't settle back and assume somebody else is going to do the work. Don't assume that you don't know how to do it or what to do. Just do the basics. Your job as a PFA is to lean in and be present. That's really a lot of what I'm hearing.
Yes, part of the course is about, if many agencies offer help, to know your role and not to step on other people's toes, because that could happen. But if there's a vacuum, somebody has to step into that vacuum. And I have a rule that if you don't step into it, somebody much worse than you will. So you kind of have this moral obligation.
You don't know me that well. If you think someone worse, okay. Well, I mean, that's great. I mean, just the awareness of it, and for us responsible mental health professionals who care about people, let's not assume that somebody else is going to jump in and do the work. Even as sparsely educated as we might be about it, by stepping in and doing something and trying, we're already mitigating the trauma by being present, by offering support. I guess water can be good too, as long as we offer support. Water could come with support, but not on its own. Wow. Can you tell us another couple of stories that sort of highlight, what this work could look like and how?
Well, again, I think what's even more relevant to therapists might not be that initial stage, but the stage right after the initial stage. And it's so important. When this child in Jerusalem died because of the bomb that we had a month ago, like I said, that had ripple effects. He was in a school, he was in a community, he had a family. And there were other witnesses of that event. And I think that's where therapists especially are called upon to step into that space and to have an emergency session because the bomb happened yesterday and my nephew needs to talk to somebody type of thing. And to know how to navigate those situations and to know what it looks like to be in acute traumatic stress and lay that out for the person going through it, to lay out for them what traumatic grief looks like in its initial stages. And, you know, I saw somebody recently who lost a child suddenly, and they were laughing uncontrollably for like 20 minutes straight. And that's a common, you know, when you think of Kubler-Ross and you think of denial, that's a common way that people show up to a traumatic event is we'll just laugh about it because we haven't yet let it seep in, and this is some sort of defense mechanism. And then they feel so ashamed because everybody sees they're laughing, they look completely nuts. And their husband was just killed because a tree fell on him after the storm outside, and they're laughing away. So, you know, knowing all the parts and pieces of this and being able to explain to people, like, that's a common thing, that happens. That's, you know, I can understand why you did that. You don't have to feel bad about that. That was your body and mind's way of preparing yourself to receive this news, receive this information. You know, I don't use technical jargon with people in these situations. You have to speak real simple, real practical, in a way that anybody can understand you, any culture, any age. So, yeah.
Wow.
You know, there's a lot of stories that are not spectacular stories, but they really bring out the heart of it for me. And that's like, you know, I was driving with my father last week. He was visiting Israel, and we saw an ambulance and a bus and a car. So when you see an ambulance, a bus, and a car, you can assume that the bus hit the car and there's an ambulance, probably, right? So I get out, I see what's going on, and I see that a car accident occurred. And because the car hit the bus, a person flew out of their seat and hit their neck on a pole in the Egged bus, in the Israeli bus. So they couldn't move and they had to be evacuated. But that wasn't the person who needed the psychological first aid. It was their friend who was traveling with them, and they don't understand what's going on. And they see that the EMTs are putting this person on a backboard and strapping them up and carrying them away. They're frightened. They're afraid their friend just died. They don't know what's happening. Translating that for them, explaining the process of what's going on, you know, offering, would you like to go with them? Negotiating with the ambulance service. Do you have room to take this friend with you to the hospital so she can accompany her? It's such simple stuff. Of course, it's more advanced also. So, you know, if a child dies by suicide, and now we are supporting the kids in that class the next day, and they're all shaken up, so then we can do all sorts of psychosocial techniques in a group or individually to support people. And again, that's more of the therapist entry to this, perhaps. But it's all important, it's all needed, and we run into all of it, in my opinion. If you open your eyes to it, you'll see it all around you. And if you know how to do it, I think you'll find that it will come to you, and you can help other people in their time of need.
Great points, great points. Tell us, I mean, I want to just invite anyone to ask any questions about this process now that Avi's kind of summarized it very clearly. Feel free to raise your hand and ask a question. Can you tell us a little bit about what it's like to be in an active war zone? I mean, you've been in Ukraine during the war, while the shellings and bombings, rockets are happening. You've been to many places where there were active hurricanes and things like that. What's it like? I mean, are you scared? Are you crazy?
I love it. I absolutely love it. To me, it's thrilling, and I thrive in those spaces. I see my sister and brother are smiling.
I think that's if anybody has like any rackets or anything that they want to send towards Ramod in Israel, feel free to send it Avi's way. He loves it.
You know, there's the idea of rising to the challenge, rising to the occasion, meeting the challenge, stepping into the ring. I think that there were a lot of life experiences that helped me to step into chaos and not be perturbed by it as much and be able to just be stoic there and operate. You know, whether it's having people that were meaningful to me, like Rabbi Tversky, Hashem Yinkom Domo, who died, who was murdered in the Harnof massacre, all sorts of people that I lost or that were injured in terror attacks. And I took martial arts for many years as well. And so when you take martial arts, the idea of
You can
walking,
karate chop a rocket.
right, but the idea of walking into danger and calculating what the level of risk is and managing that risk, that's what martial arts does, is it says, okay, this guy is 3 feet taller than you, 200 pounds heavier than you. What can you do that can mitigate his power over you and put the advantage in your hands? It can reduce risk and it can, make leverage for you to win, let's say. So the idea of stepping into the South with rockets flying or going to Ukraine with rockets flying, when you learn a lot about a subject and you get used to those spaces, you see that there's an organized chaos to the chaos. There's algorithms to it. It's not completely out there. Like, yeah, there's a terrorist running around the neighborhood, but I have very good situational awareness, but I have a gun, but I know martial arts, but I carry a knife. In my police work, we get a lot of calls for dangerous situations and for robberies. I haven't yet been in a gunfight, but I've driven to very precarious situations. And that's that idea of you're going into a dangerous place, but you're going to anticipate the risks. You're going to imagine what that looks like, and you're going to proceed based on your understanding. It's not, how do you say, Hefker? It's not just this irresponsible, careless entry into danger. I think that has to do with it. And that helped also with learning when I did postgraduate studies in Yale with, disaster management as well. What do hurricanes look like? What does going offline on a power grid for months look like? And when you know what that looks like and experience that, it helps you to walk into it.
It's less scary, but it's not necessarily less dangerous.
True. It's still precarious. That definitely is true.
Okay, let's hear a question from Barclay. Go ahead.
How do you deal with all that trauma that you see, and how do you go on, from there? Like for me, hearing it was really helpful. I think it's something that I could do, but something that I'm pretty terrified about is, facing all that trauma and dealing with all that.
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's not easy. When I dealt with Meron, the Meron crush disaster where we had, I think, 45 dead and many wounded, I was really broken after that and I needed help. I went to a psychologist. He made me a big barbecue and then he did some therapy with me and it was really nice. His name is Dr. David Green. He lives in America now. Great guy. Having self-awareness, knowing when to stop, knowing when you can't engage, knowing how to make room afterwards to do self-care, and knowing how to do self-care without drinking whiskey, without binge eating ice cream.
There's another way.
There is another way, and people don't know. But I think it's a highly personal endeavor, and I think you can learn what those other ways are. So for me personally, for example, the idea of just sitting around my house and seeing my kids playing with Lego and looking at the most mundane, innocent moments of life, looking out the window and seeing a mother pushing a baby in a carriage, shopping for something. And it's like, not everything is about death. Not everything is about murder and fires. There's also women buying clothing for their baby. There's more to what you just saw than just that experience. There's innocence in the world. There's good in the world. And you reconnect to that. And, and if you're going to watch something, you watch something that's scenic. It's beautiful. It's funny. It's different. And you're reconnecting to what the world used to be like before that experience. It's a skill, and that's actually the 5th module in the course, is you can't do this unless you know how to not break yourself in the process. And obviously that's so important. But it's a challenge. I have to tell you, it's a challenge. It certainly is. Part of it, you get used to, you get used to these events. It grows in you. That's part of it. It's like prolonged exposure. It's voluntary, and you feel you're doing something meaningful, and you get used to it. So it becomes easier to see blood, easier to see bodies, easier to hear screams. Part of it is like that, and part of it will never be like that. And we're gonna make space afterwards to take care of ourselves. I think that's the epidemic with the first responders in the United States, where they're killing themselves all the time, is that they don't have that ability. They don't have the mental health literacy and awareness about what they're feeling. They don't have good coping mechanisms, and they don't even have the time, because they're so busy, they don't have the time to rest, because they're just thrown right back into the ring another time. So that's what I would say to them.
Thank you. Do you ever get numb from seeing this stuff?
I don't think so. I don't think so. And I definitely see myself feel trauma, and I think I just manage it reasonably well. And I imagine that it's like somebody kicking me in the stomach. Like I can even describe that feeling because I have it often. Yeah.
Okay, any last
you.
questions or comments? Last chance to speak to the man who's seen so many unfortunate tragedies, but has borne witness and to the journeys of those struggling and challenged.
And to resilience, by the way, that's a message I have to tell you, Moshe. People come out of the hardest things. People are so resilient. Most people don't have PTSD. Most people don't have acute stress disorder. Most people get through hard times. Some of them have post-traumatic growth, but we're very resilient as people. And you have to know that, and you have to assume that about people. And it's very amazing to see. I just have to tell you.
Okay, well, Avi Tenenbaum, it's 5:15 in the morning in Jerusalem. Hopefully the sun will be coming up in like 2 hours or something. We're getting our eyes and legs worn from the end of the day here in the tri-state area. But we really appreciate you getting up at 3-4 o'clock to do this for us. I found this to be fascinating, and not just fascinating, but immensely helpful. I mean, the way that you structure it, the simplicity of it, makes it feel very, very touchable, reachable, you know, and something like I feel more confident than leaning in. I hope to never have to be part of a disaster or tragedy, you know, but in the event that, God forbid, I am, I certainly feel more competent and confident to lean in and just be a present figure to help people get a grip on themselves, feel supported, feel like they have their legs on the ground. I think that's amazing, and I really appreciate the work you do, and I think you're saving thousands of people out there where my heart is. So thank you for that, and thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you for the honor of being on Mondays with Moshe.
That's it. On Tuesday for you.
On Tuesday. There
Yeah.
you go.
Okay,
Thank
good
you
night.
very much.